Hello and welcome to the Data Guidance Group web conference on management of inventory or effective management of inventory. We'll divide this into 3 sessions that will cover all of the material that you see here. Today we'll talk about effective inventory management, that is, what's the problem that produces the need for inventory management. We'll begin talking about inventory management, and you'll see there are 4 questions we need to answer in order to do inventory management well. And we'll tackle the first of those questions in this conference, and then we'll continue with the other 3 questions in future conferences. And in future conferences we'll fill out or flesh out the how to do it part of inventory management and talk a little bit about tools to provide control. And then in the last segment we'll talk again, finishing out inventory management, and then we'll cover inventory control techniques and some tools that are available there. Let me say, this is not about particular software. There are several packages out there that do inventory management, and there are several techniques for inventory management. The technique we're going to talk about, and you'll see the name later in the presentation, is a technique that was developed and refined initially by a guy named Jon Schreibfeder, who was building on the work of some of his mentors. So we'll talk a little bit more about Schreibfeder and some of the research he's done. I like Schreibfeder because he's a very numerically oriented guy. He collects statistics on all of his work, and so he can give you a good idea of what you can expect by doing inventory management effectively. So what's the problem that causes us to need to do better inventory management? There's several things. Competition. Distribution channels are evolving, expanding. A lot of even small businesses are doing business overseas. And this increased competition means that we have to be more effective with inventory. The increase in competition also means that we have to cut costs, and costs affect profit margins, obviously. The fourth item, the just-in-time philosophy, leads us to do smaller and more frequent shipments, but it also raises the risk of a stock out. That is, when we run out of a particular item and we can't fill a customer order in a timely manner. Combined with that is the fact that customers want better product availability, and they want more value-added services like stocking of inventory, reserving inventory for particular customers, etc. And lastly, and a big effect now on inventory management, is that foreign suppliers that have to put the goods on the water will stretch lead times. They'll affect availability. They'll also affect order size, because most of the time we have to order in container loads or partial container loads, which kicks quantity up over and above what we might be able to get from a domestic supplier. So that's the reason for the need for inventory management. What are our goals in inventory management? To increase, or at least to maintain, customer service level. And we'll talk about the definition of customer service a little bit later on. It's a little different than what most businesses do for customer service level now. Second item is to keep the right amount of stock. And this is a Schreibfeder statistic, and the average of all the work he had done through a few years ago, he had a 34.5% decrease in inventory, over a third decrease in inventory. Now, this is not all cutting quantities stocked. It's cutting quantities, eliminating products that were stocked, selling off inventory that's obsolete, plus potentially buying more of items that we don't stock a sufficient quantity of. The third thing we want to do is we want to create more opportunities to earn profits by selling goods from inventory, because the reason for stocking inventory, or one reason to stock inventory, is to take advantage of pricing. Suppliers may run specials. We may have particular demand that we can meet, and we in many cases will lose the order, or our business will lose the order if we don't have the stock available when the customer needs it. So the last item is we want to increase the ROI on inventory, because inventory is an asset, and hopefully we are getting a return on investment on that asset. So let's take a look at effective inventory management. There are actually two components of effective inventory management. The first component is inventory control. That is making sure we have the right product in the right location with the right label, and we'll talk about that extensively in the last session. The second item is inventory management, which is how we decide to stock inventory, how we decide to turn inventory over in the business, and the combination of the two gives us effective inventory management. So let's talk about what inventory control versus inventory management is. Inventory control is controlling what's in the warehouse, protecting the inventory, minimizing the cost of filling orders. It could be considered part of inventory control is warehouse management and optimizing the picking of orders, which we'll also talk about briefly. Inventory management is replenishing stock with the right quantity at the right time of the right item. So inventory management is managing the inventory investment to create or to maximize net profit. We're going to start out talking about inventory management in this session, and we won't get all the way through. In fact, we'll only get about a third of the way into this. We're going to take some time to make sure that some of these concepts are clear during this session, and we may not go quite an hour, but at least we'll cover the main concepts here. There are 4 questions, as I mentioned earlier, that we need to answer in order to stock inventory effectively. Number 1, what to stock? That is, what items should we be keeping in the warehouse anyway? Second, when to order? When should we reorder the item? Third, how much should we reorder? What's the order quantity? And fourth, when should we change the answer to what to stock, when to order, and how much to order? So we have to answer all of those questions in order to do effective inventory management. Is there a simple answer to these questions? Yes, there's a simple answer to the questions, but I will warn you, it involves some math. So don't get particularly bogged down in the math right at this point. These equations that you're going to see and that we're going to talk about are Jon Schreibfeder's equations, and they're actually quite simple. I'll try to simplify the terms for you as we go along. So the first thing we need to come up with in inventory management is the answer to the question, what to stock, which means we need an approved stock list for each warehouse. In a warehouse, we have to realize that stocking an item is a commitment to having that product available in reasonable quantities. And let's define reasonable. Reasonable quantities means sufficient quantity to have a reasonable expectation that you will meet the desired service level. Now, you can make a decision that you need to have an item 100% of the time, in which case you're going to kick your stock quantity way up. You can decide that you need to have an item 97% of the time, or 50% of the time, or 0% of the time. And we'll talk about situations in which items that you sell, and even items that you sell large quantities of, you need to make a decision perhaps not to stock those items at all. The second thing is you got to realize what's in your warehouse right now. There are 2 kinds of things in your warehouse. The first one is stock, and that's merchandise you intended to stock, that you meant to have in the warehouse. The second thing is stuff, and that's material that got stuck in your warehouse. And by stuck, I mean put, but I also mean at one time it was stock, you intended to have it, but at this point it's obsolete, damaged, old, returned by customer, out of date, whatever we might have, it's now become stuff. And what we have to do is we have to distinguish between stock and stuff. We want to keep the stock, and we want to get rid of the stuff in whatever way we need to get rid of it. And again, we can talk about that in later sessions. All right, so how do we get this approved inventory list? How do we make a decision about what items we want to keep in the warehouse? Well, the process is fairly simple. The first thing we need to do is come up with a way to rank the products that we sell so that we can determine which items are candidates for stocking. So we need to rank the products. The second thing is we want to get rid of the items that are easy to identify as non-stock, and we want to mark the items that are easy to identify as stock. So the ones that we should obviously keep in the warehouse, we want to identify those immediately. The ones that we should obviously not keep in the warehouse, we want to identify those immediately. And typically we can do those two things. We can get those two groups sort of in mass, and we'll get a huge number of inventory items off the table because now we know these need to go on the approved stock list and these don't. Then the third thing we have to do is for everything that's left, where there's not a clear decision, either yes we stock it or no we're not going to, we have to review those in detail and make a decision on those items whether they need to be in the warehouse or not. And once we've done that, then we can develop our final list of items to stock in the warehouse. All right, so what should we consider in developing this list of items to stock? Number one is hits. Now, it's important that we understand a hit is not a quantity ordered. It is an item ordered on a sales order. So if I have an item that I sell 2,000 quantity of, but that 2,000 quantity was only on a single sales order, in other words, I got an order for 2,000, then that's one hit, not 2,000. So it's the number of times an order has appeared as a line item on a sales order in a particular period of time. Second thing we need to consider is sales volume. How much of the item do we sell, which is the quantity measure. Third is margin. What is our margin on the product? Simple margin is going to be what you sell the product for less your cost. So I buy it for $90, I sell it for $100, my margin is 10%. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is an adjusted margin. It's very important to calculate an adjusted margin because 10% is not your total cost in the item because there's also a cost to warehouse the item. So we want to adjust the margin by the cost of carrying the item. And then the last thing we want to consider is what's the connection of this particular item to other items. So I may stock a motor and I have a rebuild kit for the motor. The motor is an A product. The rebuild kit is a lower priority. I normally would not stock the rebuild kit, but because it's an important kit for me to stock, since I sell a lot of the motor, I'm going to stock the kit even though it's a low priority item. So that's the connection to other items concept. All right, so let's have a look at some actual numbers and answer some questions about which items we might want to sell. And our answer, by the way, is going to change as we go forward. Let's suppose we had one hit for 1,750 of an item. Would we stock that item? Well, not necessarily. We need to look at the pattern. We're talking about a number of hits within a particular time period. Maybe that's a month. If we sell 1,750 a month, we might stock the item. If we sell 1,750 one time last year, we might not stock it at all. So we're probably going to have to look at that item on an individual basis depending on what our trend looks like. And we'll talk about trends as they fit into this question a bit later on. Let's suppose that we sold 4 line items. We had 4 hits, and we sold almost 4,000. Well, again, we need to look at the item in more detail to determine whether we need to stock it. If we had 50 hits, and again, let's say this is within a single month, for 1,250 quantity, that's an item we're more likely to stock depending on how the other items in the warehouse or in our